Good evening and welcome to this Kansas City Public Library signature programming event. I'm Deputy Director Carrie Coogan and I'm so happy that you are here. Our event today is in coordination with an exhibit that is currently on display at the Central Library in downtown Kansas City, Missouri, called Pictures of Resistance, the wartime photography of Jewish partisan Faye Schulman. Faye Schulman wanted the world to know Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter during World War II. They mounted a resistance against their Nazi oppressors. I was a photographer, Schulman said. I have pictures, I have proof. The images capture the camaraderie, the horror and loss, and the bravery of ragtag but resolute partisans, some Jewish, some not, who fought the Germans and their collaborators. The exhibit, produced by the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation and co-presented by the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, also features a videotaped interview with Schulman. The Central Library downtown location is open and you can visit the space in person. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that you can submit your questions in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the program. And now I'd like to introduce Sheri Rosenblum for tonight's talk, and she will share the story of the women of the resistance. Of the approximately 30,000 Jews who escaped ghettos and work camps and mounted armed resistance against the Nazis during World War II, about 1 in 10 were women. They weren't always welcomed by partisan units. Women weren't deemed suitable for fighting, but nonetheless proved crucial to the cause, their work ranging from cooking and nursing to weapons transport and even combat. Sheri Rosenblum is the Director of Development and Outreach for the San Francisco-based Jewish Partisan Education Foundation and holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in Judaic Studies from UCLA and Brandeis University. Please help me welcome Sheri Rosenblum.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that warm welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let me, can everybody see that opening slide? Can you give me a thumbs up, Carrie?
Yep.
Okay, great. Good evening. As Carrie said, my name is Sheri Rosenblum, and I'm speaking with you from California this evening. I'm so happy to be here with you, and I do hope that you will have an opportunity to go see Pictures of Resistance at the library. It's really a remarkable exhibit, a one-of-a-kind opportunity for you to see the photographs of Faye Schulman, who is the only known Jewish partisan photographer. And it's really quite an extraordinary story for you to see. And I'm going to treat you in a moment to a picture of hers. Tonight, we're going to talk about Jewish resistance in general, but specifically about Jewish resistance, the resistance of Jewish women during the Holocaust. Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a Polish Jewish historian, said the future historian will have to dedicate an appropriate page to Jewish women in the war. She will take up an important page in Jewish history for her courage and her steadfastness. By her merit, thousands of families have managed to surmount the terror of the times. And for those of you who may not be familiar with him, Emanuel Ringelblum was a historian, as I mentioned, who in the Warsaw Ghetto decided that it was important that they document the horrors that the Nazis were perpetrating on the Jews of the ghetto and document what life was like in the Warsaw Ghetto. He gathered together a group of social workers, historians, poets, artists to write the history of what was going on in the ghetto, prepare poems, photographs. They put as much information as they could together in a series of metal milk cans and other strong boxes and buried them underneath the Warsaw Ghetto so that at a time in the future when the ghetto knowing that the ghetto would eventually be destroyed, and knowing that their fate, what their likely fate was, by this point they knew that Jews were being murdered by the tens and hundreds of thousands. People one day would find these documents and photographs and know what it was like for Jews living in the ghetto. And there is a wonderful book and a wonderful movie called Who Will Write Our History? And he was determined that Jews would write their history under the Nazis, and that it would not be the Nazis who wrote the history of the Jews. And we're going to move on. This is a picture of Faye Schulman's, and I like to show this picture because, as you can see, you're looking at this picture, and when you see it, you might think, as you're looking at it, that it's a beautiful woman surrounded by friends in the forest. And it could look very much like a still from a Hollywood film of that time, a Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, one of their on the road films. But it's actually Faye Schulman, who, as Carrie mentioned, was a young woman, a photographer who was living with a Russian partisan group during the Holocaust. Now, you might ask, why is she smiling? Here she is fighting in the woods. You can see that these young men have guns. Well, Faye Schulman was a woman in Lenin, Poland. Her entire family had been murdered by the Nazis. She was kept alive because she knew how to take and develop photographs. And the reason she knew how to do this was that she had apprenticed to her brother, who had a large photography studio. He fortunately had closed his studio and had left Poland before the Nazis invaded and had come to the United States. But she had acquired these skills, and the Nazis kept her alive so that she could document what they considered their victories and their successes. But very soon, they began having her train someone else to take the photographs and to develop them. And she knew that she was training her replacement. And as soon as she had that replacement trained, they were going to kill her. So one night, she escaped into the woods with her camera, and she was fortunate to come upon a Russian partisan group. And unlike what happened to many, many other young Jewish women, which we will talk about later, she was accepted into this Russian partisan group. Now, I should tell you that they had no idea that she was Jewish. And had they known, it's highly unlikely that she would have been accepted into this group. And it's also unusual that she was accepted at all because she was a woman and she was not a fighter and she did not have a weapon. But what she did have was her camera. And the leader of this partisan group had an ego. And he also wanted her to capture his successes as a partisan leader and as a military leader. And so he accepted her into the group. The other thing Faye brought with her was that her brother-in-law had been a doctor. And she had from time to time helped him around his medical practice as a family physician. And she had very basic first aid skill. But that was about the most that you could hope for in many of these partisan units. So she knew how to do some basic first aid, and they made her the medic. And that's why she was accepted into this group. So why is she smiling in this photograph? She's smiling because, as I mentioned, nobody in her group knew she was Jewish. And this was an identity that she had to hide, because had they known she was Jewish, there could have been very serious ramifications, which we'll get into later. And here on this particular day, she was wandering in the woods and she came upon these three young men who were from her village of Lenin, who were also Jewish. She just happened upon them. They had a little short reunion in the woods. And for the very first time in a year and a half, she could be herself. She could be the young Jewish Orthodox woman, Faye Schulman, and let her guard down just for those few minutes and be happy. And so she set up her camera to take this self-portrait with these young men. Now, what I want to do just very quickly, because it's very important when we talk about partisan resistance, to understand that becoming a Jewish partisan and fighting in armed heroic resistance was the last resort. And one of the things that's important to understand is that Jews fought back in every way that they could. And the whole idea of Jews going like sheep to the slaughter is a myth. And it's a very unfortunate myth that has been perpetuated really since since World War II ended. And one of the reasons the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation exists is to dispel that myth, because it's a very damaging picture of Jews being passive, and it is disrespectful to the memory and the lives of those who perished during the Holocaust and those who survived, because every single Jew who fought back, every single Jew who could fought back in every way that they could. And Elie Wiesel has a quote that he says that I will probably botch, but he talks about the question should not be why didn't the Jews fight back, but how did so many of them manage to fight back, being starved, being broken? I mean, how do you resist the largest army in the world? And the fact that they resisted in so many ways is truly amazing. So this is an example of political resistance. This is a cartoon from the Warsaw Ghetto. And you can see that as we're going through these, that a lot of these examples are from youth. A lot of the resistance was among young people, teenagers, young adults. This is from the Voice of Youth Yiddish newspaper in the Warsaw Ghetto. The cartoon in Yiddish reads, "Fascism must be smashed." The artists and the publishers of this newspaper would have been killed had this been discovered by the Nazis. Of course, any kind of resistance was strictly illegal, and they either would have been immediately sent out of the ghetto towards a concentration camp, or more likely would have just been shot on the spot, probably publicly, to discourage any other people from trying to resist in any way. This is an example of escape as a form of resistance. And this is a picture from the first Kindertransport, where people from Berlin, Jewish families from Berlin, smuggled their children to Great Britain. Usually they would choose one or two of their children, as many as they could afford, to smuggle out of the country using whatever financial resources they had left available to them, knowing that in most instances they would never see their children again. And in most instances they didn't, but even escape was an act of resistance. This is an example of staying visible. This is a Chanukiah that was put in the window of the Posner family. This was done on New Year's Eve of 1932, leading into 1933 in Kiel, Germany. You can see that the Nazis have taken over this building right across from the Posner family's home. Rachel Posner was the wife of the rabbi in Kiel, Germany. And she lit the Hanukkah, as she did all 8 nights of all 8 nights of Hanukkah, excuse me, in defiance of that flag across the street from her home. And on the back of the photograph that she took, this very photograph, she wrote, "Death to Judah, so the flag says, Judah will live forever, so the light answers." The Posners were very fortunate. They had relatives in the United States who sponsored them to come to the United States, actually before World War II even broke out. But Nazism was definitely on the rise and taking hold in Germany. I mentioned to you earlier, Emanuel Ringelblum. This is actually one of the milk cans from the Oneg Shabbos archives. This is one that has been discovered. They have discovered most of them. There is some thought that there are still a few undiscovered archives lying underneath what remains, or what was once, the Warsaw Ghetto. There's some thought that there's one lying underneath the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. It's amazing what this group of people, who for the most part knew that they were going to perish, and there were very few people who survived the Warsaw Ghetto who actually contributed to the archives. But the stories, the articles that they were able to store to tell the story of the horrors of what they went through in the Warsaw Ghetto. So this is an example of documentation, and documentation is a very critical and important act of resistance, and one that continues today and continues through the generations. So any survivor who has told their story, who has published a book, who has given their testimony to the Shoah Foundation, who has told their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren about their story during the Holocaust and what they went through and the lives of their families that were lost. And those children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who tell their friends and their schoolmates, all of that is resistance that continues. As long as we tell the story of what happened during the Holocaust, that is resistance that continues throughout the generations and must continue through education and documentation. Religious resistance was very, very prominent in the ghettos and even in the concentration camps. This is a secret religious celebration for the holiday of Simchat Torah, which we just actually celebrated last week, where you begin reading the Torah. Again, you start at the beginning. This would have been almost impossible to accomplish. First of all, the Nazis had confiscated all of the Torahs and burned them. So the fact that they were able to find a Torah in the Lodz Ghetto, which was one of the hardest ghettos to it was really the ghetto that was pretty much hermetically sealed. People were able to get in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto and other ghettos, but the Lodz Ghetto was really very, very difficult to do that. So the fact that they had this Torah there, were celebrating the holiday, all of this, had they been discovered by the Nazis or their collaborators, would have resulted in certain death and severe punishment and likely certain death. This is Abba Kovner, and he was a leader of resistance in the Vilna Ghetto in Lithuania, and he published a illegal newsletter of resistance, and he also had an illegal radio, and they would broadcast letting people know what was going on. And this is an example of speaking out, making sure everybody knew what was happening. He sent scouts out to follow the trains as they left the Vilna Ghetto to see where they were going, and quickly brought back word that people leaving the ghetto were not going to work camp or labor camps. They were being exterminated. And he spread that word immediately. He felt that people needed to know, they needed to be mobilized to fight back. And this is just one of the manifestos that he published. But he created a fighting group within the ghetto. They were successful in fighting back. And when they escaped from the ghetto, he actually founded one of the most well-known partisan groups in Lithuania called the Avengers. But in this manifesto, which is written in Yiddish, he writes, "We will not be led like sheep to the slaughter. True, we are weak and defenseless, but the only reply to the murderer is revolt. Brothers, better to fall as free fighters than to live by the mercy of the murderers. Arise, arise with your last breath." So this is clearly a call to action and a call to fight back. And this is when we start getting into moving from religious resistance, staying visible, to we know we're being killed. Our only course of action here is we need to revolt. We need to fight the murderer. And so we see that the level of resistance is having to become more forceful and to match the level of oppression that is being perpetrated against the Jews here. And you can also see here where the statement sheep to the slaughter, this is where it was first used and how it's really been bastardized, where he says we're not going to be led like sheep to the slaughter, and how over time this has been twisted. This is a drawing, a rendering of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And this is an example, obviously, both of physical resistance, but also it's an example of artistic resistance, which I will explain in a minute. As many of you probably know, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is one of the most seminal acts of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. It's very, very well known. On the first night, the first Seder of Passover, the Nazis came into the Warsaw Ghetto. Their goal, by this time, the ghetto had been liquidated from its height. There were roughly about 70,000 of the 250,000 people that had been living in the ghetto at one time remaining. Their goal was to liquidate the remaining people in the ghetto. They thought it would be very, very easy. It would take them a day or two, and their goal was to give the ghetto, deliver the ghetto Judenrein, Jew-free, to Adolf Hitler for his 54th birthday. And they had a big surprise, because what they didn't expect was that they would be met with a group of fierce Jewish fighters armed with Molotov cocktails and whatever weapons they could find. And they were aided by some Polish partisans who were friendly to Jews and assisting them as well. But they fought back, and the Germans had to retreat. They were not expecting this firefight, and they fought fiercely. This group of starving, unarmed, people that this was not what they did. These were scholars, these were accountants, these were teenagers, these were not soldiers, but they fought them off for more than a month, for longer than either the Polish army or the French army were able to hold off the German army. And that's really an amazing story. There were very few survivors, but those who did survive went to the woods and joined partisan units and continued their fight in the woods as Jewish partisans. The reason that this is also artistic resistance is you can see how the artist has chosen to depict the Nazis as cowering in the background with unformed faces, and has shown the Jews in the foreground as stronger people with their faces are defined, and you can see them as protectors of this other group of older Jews who they're clearly protecting, and has just really shown them as protagonists and the Nazis as antagonists. And so that's an example also of artistic resistance. And even in the concentration camps, resistance continued. And I should have mentioned something about religious resistance with that earlier, but if we get a chance, I will. This is the example of sabotage. And in Auschwitz-Birkenau, so Birkenau, Auschwitz is actually made up of two camps. I know and Auschwitz-Birkenau is the second camp at Auschwitz, which was the crematorium. It was the death camp part of Auschwitz. And this is Rosa Rabata, and she, together with 5 other prisoners, mounted a revolt at the Birkenau death camp where they blew up one of the crematoria. And what they did was, over the period of several months, they were working off-site at a munitions factory, a German munitions factory. And every day they would take a pinch of explosives and hide them either in their pocket, or if they were a man, the cuff of their pants. And over time, they amassed enough to create an explosive device. And they eventually created a diversion, a revolt, and were able to blow up the crematoria. They were all caught and tortured and executed publicly in front of the rest of the prisoners as a warning to the rest of them not to ever try anything like this. None of them ever divulged any other information about whether there were other people that were involved in the plot. So we don't know if it was more than the 6 of them. And this was obviously the ultimate sacrifice to destroy this, to slow down the killing at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And now we get to partisan warfare. And since we're talking about women tonight, this is Sarah Fortis. And Sarah Fortis, we're going to take a little bit of a geographical swing here from Eastern Europe to Greece, because Jewish partisans fought throughout Europe. This is Sarah Fortis, and she formed an all-female band of Jewish partisans in Greece that engaged in sabotage and actively fought the Germans. And the interesting thing about Sarah is that she worked with the Andartes, and she decided when the war broke out and the Nazis entered Greece that she didn't think it was the place of women just to sit at home cooking and doing things like that, but that they should be out there and fight as well. And so she rode her donkey throughout the Greek countryside and stopped at home, from one home to the next, asking girls to join her brigade and to fight alongside her, helping the Andartes. And they became so skilled and so relied upon by the Andartes that her group was accepted to fight alongside them, and they would use Molotov cocktails, but they were so successful that they called her Capitana Sarika, and she was this amazing Greek Jewish partisan. I know this photo's a little bit old, but you can probably see she's holding a pistol in her right hand. Sarah Fortis is still living today in Israel. And if you go on our website, there's really an amazing interview with her. It's in Hebrew, but it is subtitled. So there were about 30,000 Jews that fought back in armed resistance against the Nazis and their collaborators. And of them, about 10% were women. And they fought throughout Europe, Italy, Belarus, Poland, and they fought as in Faye's, as in Faye's case, they fought with non-Jewish units, but some of them fought with all Jewish units. And most of these women were teenagers, and often they were the only survivors of their families, which made it very, very difficult. The Jewish partisans were extremely successful in what they did. This is a picture, obviously, of a derailed train, but just for example, in Lithuania, the Jewish partisans only made up about 10% of the partisans in general, but they fought so brilliantly that they were responsible for about 79% of the train derailments, 71% of the locomotives that were destroyed, and 72% of the railroad cars that were destroyed. So they were in the units, the Lithuanian units that did this kind of destruction. And the Nazis fighting in Lithuania regarded the Jewish partisans there as a tremendous menace to their war machine there. So as I mentioned, 10% of the Jewish partisans were women. And when you really think about it, they defied gender roles. If you think about what women in the United States were doing in the 1940s, even though there was a war going on and many of them went to work, and certainly there were women in the United States Army, some even flying planes. They weren't running along battlefields, dodging bullets. And you have to think about how much courage and perseverance that these young women had, sabotaging bridges, railroads, gathering essential food and medicine, and tending to the wounded. It was really incredible. And when you think about it, most of these women, until this time, they weren't prepared for this. They had been living lives, for example, and this is Sonia Orbach. And before the war, Sonia Orbach, like so many of these other young women, they're living at home with their parents. Maybe they're taking an art class after school or a music class. And all of a sudden, their lives are completely disrupted because one day this Nazi army invades your town and your life doesn't change gradually, it changes overnight. And so there's really no time to acclimate to the new life you have. And one day it's this, and the next day you're running for your life to the forest. And you go from, 0 to 100 in the matter of weeks or months. And so these young women had to adjust. Many of them had to adjust to losing parents or siblings, and then they find themselves on the run for their lives. And so what they had to accomplish was truly amazing. So we're going to talk a little bit here about Sonia. At 16, Sonia and her mother and her father and her uncle escaped from the Lubmol ghetto in Poland. And she had two older brothers who had already gone off when Poland was invaded to join the Red Army. They were never heard from again. So it's presumed that they died in battle. And they lived in, after they escaped from the ghetto, they lived in the forest for about a year on their own, trying to make it by themselves, not very successfully. They were suffering from frostbite and starvation, but eventually they came upon an all-Russian group. And Sonia's uncle had been a fur trapper, and he really knew the area very, very well. So they were able, even though none of them had any combat skills, and obviously Sonia's parents were older, they were not young people, they accepted her family into their group because the uncle had these amazing scouting skills that they very much needed, so that their group as a whole, the partisan group as a whole, could stay safe and undetected by the Russians. And so they allowed Sonia's family to be accepted into the group, even though they were Jews. So this particular partisan group wasn't friendly to Jews, but they didn't hate them all outright. However, they didn't want to get caught with a Jewish family by other partisan groups or the Nazis. And so they insisted immediately that Sonia change her name. Sonia's original name was Sarah. And immediately they said, here there are no Sarahs, you will now be called Sonia. And Sonia kept that name until the day she died. And in fact, her autobiography was entitled, Here There Are No Sarahs. So Sonia quickly became the medic, and she also, for the group, and sometimes she also had to cook and clean for 25, 30 people around the camp, but she was made the medic. And she talked about how when she was out on the battlefield, how important it was for her to be fighting back and fighting against the Nazis in her way. She used to say that she didn't even, that there would be bullets flying by her head, and she didn't even duck down, because if she was going to die, she was going to die as a fighter and not because she was a Jew. And she would always carry with her 2 grenades, one for the enemy and one for herself in case she got shot, in case she got caught. And now we're just going to hear a minute from Sonia in her own words.
From all sides, there was shooting. I didn't even bend down my head. I wasn't worried I was again going to get killed. If I was going to get killed, I was going to get killed as a fighter, not because I'm a Jew. So that itself gave us strength to go on. This was the mentality of people who went through all these atrocities in the ghettos. So this is the way we crossed railroads at middle of the night, and the railroads were watched. And we tried to avoid it, but it wasn't possible. From all sides, there was shooting.
So I love Sonia. Sonia lived in the Bay Area. She passed away about actually 3 years ago exactly on Sukkot, and she was a wonderful, wonderful woman. She used to speak quite a bit to school groups in the Bay Area. And one of the things that she always would tell people was that it's always important to fight back, and that you should always speak out against anti-Semitism and oppression, and to speak out early and to stand up against hatred in all of its forms. And I don't know if you can see the poster behind me, but that actually is a rendering of her, that it's important to stand up for what you believe in. And that it was important to her that people always knew that that people did not go like sheep to their death, that they were fighting every way that they could. So a lot of times I get asked, what kind of jobs did people do in the partisans? And here's an example. I mentioned to you before when we talked about Abba Kovner that in the Vilna ghetto, there was this illegal newspaper. Well, believe it or not, there were newspapers in the forests as well. And this is a partisan newspaper. Obviously, they must have stolen this newspaper press, but here they're publishing a newspaper, and they would circulate it among partisan units so that they would know what was going on, and they would share resources. One of the things I do want to say, Sonia's case was very unique. So Sonia, as you know, was in a partisan group with her parents. And most young women did not have that luxury. And so they may have escaped with a brother or a sister or a group of other kids from their youth group who managed to survive when their ghetto was liquidated, or the Nazis came into their town and took everybody out to the woods and shot them. And so they would come to these groups, and if they were lucky, maybe they came to a Jewish group. But for the most part, they would come to either Polish groups or particularly in Eastern Europe. And of course, the situation in Western Europe was different, but we're primarily talking about Eastern Europe. Russian groups where they had nothing and they didn't come with arms, and they're asking for shelter and they want to fight. But these groups were made up of ex-Russian, ex-Soviet POWs who had been captured by the Nazis, or people that had been in the Russian army. And many of them were anti-Semitic. Many of them were, see these young women coming, they want entry to these groups. They have nothing. And there was a lot of pressure on these young women to barter to get into the group with sexual favors. And it was a really difficult situation for women. Many women were forced to take forced husbands. And that was actually a form of protection in some ways, because it protected them from multiple rapes among these groups. But in some instances, it was really the only currency that they could offer to be allowed to get into these partisan groups. And it's a part of the partisan story that is often left sort of not discussed, because it's a very painful part of the story to talk about, and understandably so. So it's one that we often don't talk about, but it's for Jewish partisans themselves in general, the whole inability to get into a non-Jewish partisan group was a factor, because there was so much anti-Semitism, and partisan groups did not want to accept Jews, particularly Jews that came without weapons. There was a whole joke, there's this famous saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There was a joke among Jewish partisans, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, except if it's a Jewish partisan. Well, that held, for Jewish women, there was a double strike. There was the double strike of being Jewish, and there was the extra strike of being a woman. So getting into a partisan group for a Jewish woman, especially a non-Jewish partisan group, was very, very difficult, and they had very many obstacles to overcome. And Faye, of course, who's pictured right here, was lucky because she had these things that were of value to the commander of the group. One was her medical degree, let's call it. She knew how to put on bandages. and the other was her photography, which was amazing. And she was really left alone and respected, but she was fearful her entire time that she was with this group that she would be discovered as being a Jew, and that upon that discovery, she would be immediately kicked out of the group. So much so that she tells the story. She was Orthodox, obviously. I mentioned that before. She tells a story about how on Passover, she was afraid to, she didn't want to eat bread. And because this was a Russian group, they had, enough food. It wasn't like some of the groups that were eating grubs. And she didn't want to eat bread. And all she ate was potatoes. And she was afraid that they would figure it out, that she wasn't eating bread. She's only eating potatoes. They'd figure out that she's not eating bread because it's Passover, and they would kick her out of the group. That would be the best case scenario. They'd kick her out of the group, and there she'd be stuck in the woods and with no protection. And the worst case scenario is that maybe they would kill her because she'd been keeping this fact from them for a year. And none of that ever came to pass, but it was a fear that she lived with every day, the discovery of her being Jewish. And so these were very real factors for these poor young women. Here's another picture of her with her guns. I'm going to I know we want to leave time for questions too. So I do want to just talk about one more Jewish partisan, and this is Judith Boyarsky. She was 16 years old when she came with her father and her brother to join the Jewish partisans after the rest of her family was murdered. And Gertie, things were fine in the partisans. They were with a Russian partisan group, and her father and her brother came with arms, and they were fighters, but they were both killed. And at that point, Gertie didn't offer much value, according to the commander of the group, any longer. Her father, who had become friendly with the commander, they were peers about the same age, decided that if Gertie wanted to stay with the group, he wanted her to become his mistress. And Gertie wasn't going to have any of that. And she basically said to him, absolutely not. And there was, a back and forth, but I want to stay. I want to fight. I want to prove that I can become a fighter. And so he finally agreed that Gertie could stay with the group if she performed guard duty on her own for 2 weeks. So this meant guarding the entire camp at night on her own by herself. And this was in a very Nazi-infested forest. So Gertie did that, and he had to keep his end of the bargain. She recounted later on that it was 2 weeks that felt like 2 years, but she became a very highly respected member of that partisan group. And I'm going to let her tell you a story about what happened with Gertie on International Women's Day.
I was called in actually.
Oh, wait a minute.
To the
Sorry.
wife.
We went two girls. There was a little bridge.
And
sorry.
I was a youngster.
Wait a minute.
Wood.
Sheltered.
And that little
Did
bridge
not go
connected
out,
the
didn't
Germans
have
to
any-
go
Sorry
from
about
one
that.
town to another.
I have,
For
okay.
ammunition, for
There we
forage,
go.
things like that. And we were supposed to burn that bridge. We came into the Russian village and we said, we need kerosene and we need straw in 5 minutes. We haven't got. We said, if you don't have, we'll kill the whole town. Either you give us or you're gonna be killed. They gave us in 5 minutes kerosene and straw. And we put a fire underneath that bridge. The Germans saw it, a fire. They happened a fire on us with all the ammunition that they could do. We didn't chicken out. That bridge burned. When we came back, the commander said that we did it very good. And we got Order Lenina, a medal.
I was
Frank
told
Blackman's
Sorry.
Jewish unit had their own
Well,
rules
two
for the
girls.
protection and
Commander's
respect
wife.
of their
Sorry, I don't know why all these videos are playing at the same time. Anyway, so Gertie Boyarsky was very proud of herself. I know her accent's a bit thick, but on International Women's Day, she burned down this important supply bridge, and she was eventually awarded with the Order of Lenin, which was a medal that was awarded to many heroes of the war. Many of our Jewish partisans have that award, and they're extraordinarily proud of it. So I do want to leave time, and I know I've gone over a little bit. I do want to say that there's many opportunities to learn more about the amazing Jewish women and the challenges that they face when you really think about how they went from these women, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old women, going from everyday lives like women in the 1940s were living, being in high school, having your entire life disrupted, finding yourself on the run for your life, and then making a decision once you've escaped to the forest. Certainly they had an opportunity to stay in hiding, but they chose to fight back, to risk their lives. Some women did not survive when they chose to fight back. There is a young woman, her name was Sonia Bedzowski. Her sister was a Jewish partisan named Leah Johnson, whose story is on our website. But Sonia Bedzowski was with the Belsky Brigade, and she went out on a mission to gather medicine, and she was never seen from again. They've never been able to find out whether she was tortured by the Gestapo or whether she was simply rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. But she lost her life clearly, and that happened to women. So they made this choice to survive, to fight back. And it's really an incredible story of their resilience, the way that they defied gender roles, the choices they made. And, I just want to leave you with really the life lessons of the Jewish partisans, which are to speak out early and stand up against anti-Semitism and oppression in all its forms, that young people, and clearly these were young people, can make a difference, and that one should never, ever give up. And now I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you and answer questions. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, that was wonderful, Sheri. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Amazing stories.
Sorry about the weird videos. Sometimes that happens.
It's okay. That sometimes happens on Zoom, right? We have time for a few questions. One sort of talks a little bit about what you were just alluding to. People were asking, what books or movies do you recommend to the audience about the Jewish partisan resistance and the experience? Are there books or movies out that you could recommend?
There are a lot of great books. Well, first of all, there is a Hollywood movie, which is the movie Defiance, which came out in 2008. We were historical advisors on it. It's with Daniel Craig and Liev Schreiber, and it is a very good movie about the largest all Jewish partisan unit, the Belsky group, and it's a very good movie. We actually have a study guide that goes with that movie, which if any of you are teachers on here, you should definitely go and visit our website, because there's all sorts of free curriculum that you can download and use with your students. So please do visit jewishpartisans.org. But that's a great movie to watch. There are a lot of partisan biographies out there. Faye Schulman has her own book. It is, now why am I like looking at all my books here? Her book is a Partisan's Memoir by Second Story Press, and it's got her photographs in it as well. That's a really, really great one. There are a lot of books about the Belsky brothers. There's I'd rather die fighting by Frank Bleichman. The one I mentioned about Sonia Orbach, which is Here There Are No Sarahs, is a really great autobiography. But there are a lot of Jewish partisan books out there. For young readers, there's a scholastic book that a lot of educators use in their classrooms called We Fought Back. And it has 10 Jewish partisan stories in it. It features 10 different Jewish partisans. And I know educators seem to really like that. And a lot of classrooms do projects around those. It features Sonia, it features Frank. It's got a combination of different partisans that are featured in it. And it's a great book for 5th, 6th, 7th graders, 8th maybe up to. I would definitely, for adults, I think watching Who Will Write Our History, which came out about a year and a half ago, is a great documentary to watch, because it really talks about the Warsaw Ghetto and how painstakingly these people, under penalty of discovery in the wee hours of night, under, in extreme secrecy, were documenting what was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto, because they really didn't know what the outcome would be and whether the Nazis would succeed in destroying the entirety of Jewish civilization, that they didn't want Jews to be anything anybody ever knew about Eastern European Jewry to be through the eyes of the Nazis, Yeah.
Well, and for the audience, we can also put together a reading list. We have a great director of your services here at the library, October, and we could put it together, and then you can check the books out from our library here. And you had some great suggestions there, and I like that you offered some children's books as well.
Right.
Here's an interesting question from someone who's an artist who says, I like to make political and historical art. I'd like to make something about women in the Holocaust, but is there anything or anyone I should focus on in particular?
Wow. I mean, there's so many really incredible women. I did a program last week with Yad Vashem where I talked about partisans, and the woman from Yad Vashem talked about the couriers. And she focused on these 3 women who were couriers who masqueraded as non-Jews throughout the entire war. 2 of them were killed in Auschwitz and 1 of them survived. And I don't know if she's still living. She may still be living in Israel. And there's so many amazing women, partisans, people like Hannah Senesh, who was living in Israel, parachuted in to try and save Hungarian Jews and was caught and captured and tortured. And there are non-Jews like Irena Sendler, who rescued Polish Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. They're really incredibly amazing women who accomplished so much and were so incredibly brave. It would be really hard to pinpoint one.
Yeah, well, that's good. You brought up Auschwitz a couple of times, and I want to mention for the audience members who might be here in Kansas City, Missouri, there's an incredible Auschwitz exhibit at Union Station right now, and you may have heard of it. I'm sure you have, Sheri. It's Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. and it's incredible. It's only been in New York City and in Kansas City, Missouri, and then I think it's headed back over to Europe. So for anybody who's watching this, the exhibit down at Union Station here in Kansas City lasts through January of 2022, and it is incredible and tells so many harrowing stories and mentions some of what you've been talking about. Another question from somebody who likes to write about the Holocaust. When writing about it, what's something that you think should definitely be included, or maybe something that you don't see represented a lot in the story of the Holocaust?
Well, I think one of the things that's not represented a lot is this whole idea of resistance. And it would amaze you when I talk to people, or if I go in a room and I ask, how many of you know that Jews fought back during the Holocaust, or know that Jews resisted during the Holocaust? Most people don't know that. And even the founder of the organization founded JPEF because he had gone all through school not knowing that Jews fought back during the Holocaust. I mean, there was this whole idea that people just, lined up to get on the trains and go, walk into the showers. And I think for so many reasons, that's important. For Jews, it's important because it's important for Jewish identity, for people to understand that you're not part of a people that are constantly victimized. But for young people, it's really important to know that even in the worst of situations, that you always have a voice and there's always a way to speak up and to fight back, because the whole example that the partisans set, and, we have it throughout all of our curriculum. We talk about bullying, we talk about, there's always, what we're trying to do with the lessons that we teach in our curriculum is to create upstanders. I mean, that's what the partisans were. They were upstanders. There's always a way, we're not to speak out and to change the situation, to do something about it.
When you think about the women who are part of these partisan brigades, were their missions ever something that were unique to them being a woman? In other words, were they a secret weapon in that they could do some task or some job that a man couldn't get away with? Was simply the fact that they were women help them do something unique? Or
I think that they weren't suspected sometimes, that they would go in, and if they were, stealing food or something like that, yes. But, so much of it was about not being detected as a Jew, that they really had to, if you were to watch the films and stuff, they really operated in the cover of darkness. They talk about how, you'll see in the films how the forest was their friend, and the full moon was their enemy. They had to operate in the cover of darkness when they went in to get supplies and that kind of stuff. So, things like, certainly for the couriers that I mentioned, for them, they were definitely less suspecting than a male, courier or something like that forging documents. You would not be thinking of a woman forging documents or that kind of thing. But there was so much about not wanting to be detected, that they were really operating undercover. But yes, in Gertie's instance, when you march into town and you demand straw and kerosene to blow up a bridge, people kind of know what you're doing. But I think if you were kind of doing it clandestinely, it wouldn't be as obvious.
Here's a sad question. During the last few months, I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in forms of quote unquote jokes. What do you say? What can people do to show resistance to those kinds of things?
I think that the first thing, and I don't know if that's from a student or just in general, I think it's really hard. And whoever wrote that, I sympathize with you and I feel your plight. I myself grew up in a town where there were not very many Jews and had that experience myself, being one of, maybe 5 Jews in my grammar school. The first thing that, and it's hard, and Sonia would tell you, speak out early and fight back, is that you have to tell, the first thing you have to tell the person is that it's not okay. Sometimes people don't understand it, but that's where it starts. It starts with the speech, and it starts with them not getting that it's not okay. I wish I could find it. And if this person wants to give you their email address or something, Deborah Lipstadt had this great quote at our dinner a couple years ago, and her book would be a great one to read. She probably said it somewhere in her book as well, but that's where it starts. The conversation has to start kind of around the dinner table or around your cafeteria table or wherever that happens, where you have to put a stop to it and say, that might be okay you might think you're joking, but that kind of talk is not okay. So for example, like this guy that just got fired from Jeopardy, the producer, and he just got fired and because of some of the comments he said about Jews having big noses. And some people are like, oh, that was too much. He shouldn't have gotten fired. And he was just joking. Okay, he was just joking, but it's not a joke. And it's not okay. And he didn't say, he singled out a people and he made a joke, and it's not appropriate. And we can find somebody else who doesn't make comments like that to host the world's most popular game show, right? So people have to know that it's not okay. And so it becomes difficult when, especially if you're sitting around your table at school and maybe it's the most popular kid in school that says it and you don't want to speak up and you have to find that courage in yourself. You have to channel Judith Boyarsky or Sonia or one of the other partisans. And that's what we try and do with our curriculum, is give kids courage and have them learn from the partisans that, wow, if the partisans could do this, then I could turn to the kid at my table who just said, hey, I want to go have a bar mitzvah because I'll get lots of presents like Jewish kids because all Jews are rich, or whatever it is that they think is a joke, but is really not a joke. To say, why did you say that? Let me set the record straight, or whatever it is, because they don't get that that's anti-Semitism. That, we have to give kids and people in general, it's not just about anti-Semitism, it's any kid out there that's being discriminated against for their religion, their race, whatever it is. This applies across the board.
Right. Well said. And not just students, adults. We all should speak.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Sheri, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. Thank you so much for your work. We're so thrilled to have you here at the library.
Thank you. Thank you
Sheri
for having me.
And for anybody out there, we hope you'll come to the Downtown Central Library and see the exhibit, Pictures of the Resistance, and we'll get that book list out to everybody, hopefully tomorrow.
And also on our website, if you go to our resource page, there's a list of books also.
What's your website?
www.jewishpartisans.org.
Great.
And teachers, there's tons of curriculum.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.